Thank you for watching. My name is Rasha, and today I want to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Domestic violence can and does affect anyone, but we do recognize that certain demographics experience higher rates of domestic violence. Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be murdered and 2.5 times more likely to experience some type of domestic abuse. In order to understand domestic violence in Indigenous communities, we have to first look back at colonization and how that has impacted Indigenous communities today. We need to understand that the main social determinant of health in Aboriginal people in Canada is due to the historical impacts of colonization and forced assimilation. This led to intergenerational trauma, communities struggling today against discrimination, stigma, poverty, and social exclusion. The most disturbing and damaging outcomes of domestic violence are mental health and addiction issues. For women experiencing violence, they have limited access to helping services, as most are located in large cities, far from remote reserves where many of the women live. There's programs that often find staff limited cultural competence and program supports that have little cultural safety or relevance to them. So the homicide survey reveals that Aboriginal women were disproportionately represented as homicide victims and have higher rates of self-reported spousal and non-spousal violence. Indigenous women represent 10% of the total population of missing women in Canada between 2016 and 2019, which means that there are around 3 deaths per month that happened during that period, all being victims of homicide. There are 1,017 homicides of Indigenous women between 1980 and 2012, but those are reported cases. It is found that the number is much higher, being closer to 4,000. The reason why there's a big discrepancy between those two numbers is because if there is an unknown case where an individual is removed from the missing reports database at some point, there is not evidence that exists to determine whether they were found or are deceased. There's also the underreporting of violence against Indigenous women and girls and lack of effective database. Even with the inquiry made by the Government of Canada into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, there's still a pattern of violence consistent despite this inquiry. It was found that the highest rates of missing Indigenous women were in Alberta, cases between 2015 and 2019, followed by Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and then BC. There's a common misconception that Indigenous women are involved in high risk or dangerous work. Even if there was a case that was reported including high risk or dangerous work, that doesn't mean that their life is any less valuable or should not be recognized. Many women who had gone missing were students completing post-secondary education, such as Loretta Saunders, an Inuit woman murdered at the age of 26 in 2014, who was completing her honors thesis on this very issue at the time that she went missing. Some were only children, such as 14-year-old Azariah Akabi Coco Penis and 15-year-old Tina Fontaine, were both in the child welfare system at the time, or 16-year-old Delane Copenace. This ongoing tragedy affects all Indigenous women and girls from all walks of life throughout many communities and cities across Canada. Although some perpetrators are known to the victim, many are strangers. Author Janice Akous also drew attention to the racialized and sexualized legacy of settler colonialism that has led to an acceptance of violence towards Indigenous women. She noted that these colonial attitudes have justified many of the legally sanctioned policies that have targeted Indigenous women and families, such as the Indian Act and residential schools. Other examples include the pass system, which is a process by which Indian agents approved passes for First Nations people to leave the reserve for whatever reason, and forced sterilization. So these policies severely limited Indigenous women's livelihood by severing community ties and preventing Indigenous women's access to community resources and safety networks. Colonial attitudes also justified the mass removal of Indigenous children through policies of state apprehension, such as the 60s scoop, and this continues today in what is known and referred to as the millennial scoop. Violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada today cannot be understood without first examining the effects of Canada's deep history of settler colonialism on Indigenous families and communities. In October 2004, Amnesty International released a report called Stolen Sisters, a human rights response to discrimination and violence against Indigenous women in Canada. This was in response to the appalling number of Indigenous women who are victims of racialized and sexualized violence. This report was positioned as a call for action. Amnesty highlighted the stories of 9 women, including Helen Betty Osborne, who was a Cree woman abducted and killed at the age of 19 by 4 white men in Manitoba in 1971, and her 16-year-old cousin, Felicia Solomon, whose remains were found in the Red Deer River in 2003. The report also noted a lack of comprehensive reporting and statistical analysis and called for more police accountability, stating that Indigenous women are both over-policed and underprotected. Amnesty documented the social and economic marginalizations of Indigenous women, noting that racism, poverty, and marginalization, along with a lack of police protection, heighten Indigenous women's vulnerability to violence. Tragically, since 2004, the numbers have continued to rise. 5 years after the initial report, Amnesty International released No More Stolen Sisters. This report highlighted the following 5 key issues as reasons to the continued national tragedy of violence against Indigenous women. The first is the role of racism and misogyny in perpetuating violence against Indigenous women. The second is the sharp disparities in the fulfillment of Indigenous women's economic, social, political, and cultural rights. The second is the continued disruption of Indigenous societies caused by the historic and ongoing mass removal of children from Indigenous families and communities. The fourth is disproportionately high numbers of Indigenous women in Canada prisons, many of whom are themselves the victims of violence and abuse. The fifth is the inadequate police response to violence against Indigenous women, as illustrated by the handling of missing persons cases. In 2013, the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police called for a report on missing and murdered Indigenous women to help guide operational planning. RCMP released Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women, a national operational overview. This report documented a total of 1,181 people, 164 missing Indigenous women, and 1,017 Indigenous female homicide victims between 1980 and 2012. Prior to reports, the RCMP's investigations of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls had included a stretch of British Columbia's Highway 16, known as the Highway of Tears. While the RCMP acknowledges 18 murders and disappearances, mostly Indigenous women and girls, in its list of Highway of Tears cases dating from 1969 to 2006, Indigenous groups argue that this number is misleading because it reflects only the disappearances and murders that have happened in a specific geographic area, and that the real number in northern British Columbia exceeds 40. So groups including Amnesty International and the Legal Strategy Coalition on Violence Against Indigenous Women critique the RCMP report for having critical gaps in their data. So they noted that the 2015 update only included cases within the RCMP's own jurisdiction. Over 300 non-RCMP police agencies were included in the original 2014 report, but these were excluded from the update. This is concerning given the mistrust and violence that has historically categorized Indigenous police relationships. So the report was also criticized because it highlighted intimate partner violence as a risk factor, which places blame on Indigenous men and communities while failing to point out that many of the perpetrators are acquaintances and strangers. There's already so much trauma and a lot going on in these victims' families, and to be brushed off and not have it taken seriously is unacceptable, and there needs to be a change. We hear of a lot of cases where the bodies of missing Indigenous women have still not been found and that they're not taken seriously by the police. There's some type of closure when you get to bury your loved one, and to have families who aren't able to do that because their bodies are still missing is something that families should not have to go through, and more needs to be done to find these women. This information is extremely heartbreaking, and it can feel a little bit helpless, but just know that if you do want to help and you do want to reach out to communities and help them have their voices heard, there are ways to do that. The biggest goal is to seek justice not only in these missing women, but also the perpetrators. There are annual marches, vigils, the making of documentaries, and other awareness campaigns that have brought people together. There's the annual Women's Memorial March, also called Their Spirits Live Within Us, which takes place every February 14th since the early 1990s. These memorial marches take place across Canada to raise awareness, promote empathy and compassion, and bring healing to families that have lost a loved one. When it comes to domestic homicides, no matter the situation or the environment that a person was in, should not determine the respect and the attention that it gets. These women and girls were taken from their families way too early. They have left behind family, friends, children. These women and girls were human beings that were taken away from this world in a very senseless act. To ignore and to dismiss these stories is a disgrace, and more justice needs to be brought for them. If you want to learn more about their stories, as well as where to donate to help Indigenous organizations that are either helping families or need funding for resources, please head to www.nadiashopefoundation.com.